We're back for the fourth and final part of our tutorial on how to render sections and elevations using Photoshop. In this tutorial, what we'll be looking at is how to import trees into your drawing using PNG files. We'll get a little bit more practice in on using adjustment layers, and we'll be looking at LUTs. Now, LUTs are a very handy device that you can use when you don't have time to refine the drawing to your satisfaction, but you have to tidy it up very quickly because you're meeting a client or you have a presentation. So we'll have a look at those as well. When we left it at the end of part 3 of the tutorial, we were beginning to look at landscaping and we put in some grass, and now we're going to look at putting in some trees. Typically when we're looking for images to use to create materials, we just go on the internet, we find the image we want, we paste it into Photoshop, and away we go. But with some materials we might want to do things a little bit differently, and trees are one of those materials. So when we begin our search for a suitable tree, we go on Google in the normal way, type in trees for Photoshop, and then we'll probably just click on images. Now when we go to images, we'll notice that quite a few of the trees show up having a checkerboard background. Now this is the start of what it is that we're looking for. What we do is we'll click on the tree that we think is most suitable for our image, and when we get there, instead of copying that image, we actually go to the site that is selling or giving us access to the image, and we'll download the image, because what we want is the original PNG file. Because if we just copy the image itself, we'll get the tree plus the checkerboard background. We want the tree on its own without the checkerboard background. Now, as it happens, I've already downloaded a tree. It's a generic deciduous tree, kind of like the type you might find in Ireland. It's not a great tree, but it's a good tree and it will do. So here it is on my desktop, and all I'm going to do is just drag it over to my Photoshop file, and presto, it appears as its own layer. And as you can see, this is exactly what we want. It's a tree that does not have a background, and we can see through the gaps in the leaves. Now let's rename the layer to tree and then make some copies by hitting Ctrl J a few times. Now, I could do it with the help of a layer mask, and as it happens, I already have a mask that can help me. The mask that we generated when we were creating the environment and the sky is exactly the mask we need now to sort out our trees. So let's copy that layer mask up onto one of our tree layers and see what happens. If I move the other tree layers out of the way, we'll see that the tree that we applied the mask to is now hidden behind the house. And now that we know it works, we'll just apply the same mask to some of the other trees so they too can vanish behind the house. So don't pay too much attention to what I'm doing right now. I'm just messing around with the trees a little bit until I come up with a kind of random landscape. If I were doing this for real, I'd be much more selective about the species I'm using. But because this is just a tutorial, I'm just going to use the same tree over and over again. So over on the left, you can see that I'm resizing one of our trees to make a hedgerow. A bit of a cheat, but it will do. So I just squeeze it down until it's just about the right size. And when I've done that, I'm going to make a copy of that layer by hitting Ctrl J, just so that I can bring some variety into the hedgerow. And this is where we're going to start practicing on our adjustment layers. I'm going to use adjustment layers to bring some variety into our trees. If I choose the vibrant setting, that will adjust the color intensity in a number of different ways. I need to remember to right click on the adjustment layer and choose Create Clipping Mask to make sure that the adjustments I make only apply to the one layer that's directly below my adjustment layer and not to all of the layers below. And the other thing I can do is I can apply more than one adjustment layer to a layer. So here I'm going to apply some brightness and contrast adjustments to the same tree, and I'm going to make sure that I have a clipping mask, and then I'm going to play with those adjustments to my heart's content until I have something that looks a little bit like a hedgerow over to the left of my house. I'm kind of satisfied with that. Time to move on. This tree to the right, let's just see what happens when I apply a hue and saturation adjustment layer to it. I just make sure that its clipping mask is active, and then if I go up to the adjustment sliders above, you can see I can change the colors of the leaves around a little bit, and it can look a little bit more like spring or a little bit more like autumn. I'm just going to have a little bit of fun playing around with this tree. I'm going to resize it and give it an adjustment layer. I might just make it a little bit darker, add a bit of contrast. And with the next one, I'm going to do a trick we've done several times before. I'm going to select it, then I'm going to go up to Edit, choose Transform, and then I'm going to flip it horizontal. So I'm getting a brand new tree for free. And when I give it its own vibrance adjustment layer and give it a clipping mask, it will look brand new. There, I think that'll just about do it. Now, I'll just speed through as I give the next tree a bit of a makeover. I'm going to give it a couple of different adjustment layers, have a bit of fun. Get some variety in there. I think that'll just about do it. Now I'm going to select all of the tree layers that I've been working on so far. So that's all of the trees really, with the exception of one. I'm going to leave that alone. And I'm going to put these trees I've been working on into a group, call them trees, and give them a color. Now let's just do a little bit of reorganization of our layers here. I want to get the red layer to its correct location in the stack before I do the next thing. And the next thing is going to be with this tree, which is being singled out for special treatment because it's going to be located at the front of the house. Now this layer here, I'm actually going to right click it and rasterize it. I'm going to choose rasterize layer. That is, I'm going to change it from a vector-based image to a pixel-based image because I think I'm going to need that for some of the operations I'm going to perform in the next couple of minutes. But first, with that particular tree layer selected, I'm just going to go over and pick the rectangle selection tool and clip off that part of the trunk that I don't really want in my image. Now I'm going to rename that layer to something more appropriate, and then I'm going to copy it because I'm going to use the copy to make a shadow. The layer I'm going to make the shadow from, I'm going to bring down and to the right. Then I'm going to select it, and first of all, I'll just rename it. Then I'm going to go up to Image, come down to Adjustments, choose Levels, and then I'm going to bring this slider down until I've created a silhouette of the tree. So this will be the basis of my shadow. Then with the shadow layer selected, I'm going to use the rectangle tool to clip off that part of the shadow that I don't really want. I'm going to drag the shadow layer below the red layer. And then I'm just going to bring the opacity level down a little bit so that it looks more like a shadow and less like a strong silhouette. Now, after that, I just want to make sure that those parts of the tree shadow that at the moment are falling into thin air, in other words, they're not falling onto the roof of the building, I'm just going to select those elements that aren't actually visible in real life, and I'm going to delete them. Control D will get rid of those ants and free me up for a new operation. And with the shadow layer still selected, I go to the rectangle selection tool and I'm going to drag a rectangle over that part of the shadow which falls on my roof. And after that, it's up to Edit, then choose Transform and then Distort. And as you can see, what it does is just sort of makes that shadow look a little bit more like it's actually falling on a sloping roof rather than a surface which is completely vertical. Now, I'm not doing it in any scientific way. I'm just eyeballing it, but it's going to make that shadow look a little bit more convincing. And before I leave the shadow layer alone, obviously by creating that distortion, I created another little area of shadow which is not falling on a surface where a shadow would fall. It's sort of floating in the sky. So I want to go in there and delete that. And so when I bring the original tree back in and show the natural slate of the roof finish, I'll just mess around a little bit with the opacity of the shadow layer until I have something that I can live with. And then I'm going to gather up the shadow and the tree, the front tree, and I'm going to put them into their own little group so that they are a different group from the trees to the back of the house. Okay, let's switch on all of the layers that we worked on and just get a sense of what this image is beginning to look like. I'm not going to populate the image now with any more objects. We have the technique down and it's up to you to decide how you'd like your section to look. However, when we have a bit of time in our hands and we're able to make careful selections of material from the internet that we want to use, say, for our materials, usually we end up selecting materials that have a fundamental color match. But when we're in a rush, like for example, we have a presentation or we're meeting a client, we often don't have the luxury of doing that. We just have to grab whatever material we can find. And sometimes what happens is we end up with an image that can look a little bit on the crude side, which I think it'd be fair to say is what ours looks like at the moment. It's all the elements are there, but it's a little unrefined. When we don't have the time to color correct all our materials, there are a couple of tricks that we can use to try and somehow make the image look a little bit more refined than it truly is. So let's have a look at a couple of those options now. Now, if I've organized my layers correctly, I can go to the layer just below the pattern layer and I can apply an exposure adjustment layer. But you can see when I start to adjust the properties, it's not really having the effect that I want. So there is a kind of a fast way to make this technique work. I take my magic wand tool and I select anything that might be considered in section. So that's anything from the structure of the house or anything from the substrate. And once I've selected that, I'm going to go down to the background layer and I'm going to choose layer via copy. In other words, anything that is in section, I'm now going to put it onto its own layer. I'm going to simply rename that layer white just for now, and I'm going to drag it to just above the most recent adjustment layer that we made so that that adjustment layer will not affect our new white layer. So when I start to make adjustments now on that adjustment layer, which incidentally I should have mentioned earlier are set for exposure, none of these adjustments affect anything that is on the white layer. In other words, anything that is in section. So there's a strong contrast now between anything that is in section and anything that is in the background. In other words, anything that's part of the picture. And this brings me to something that I'd like to discuss. When you're starting off in architecture and you're making either plan or section drawings, I think it's preferable that anything that is shown in section, whether it's part of the structure of the building or whether it's part of the substrate, in other words, walls, roofs, floor slabs, etc., or anything below the ground line, it's preferable, in my opinion, that you leave those areas unhatched. In other words, that they appear to be plain white if you're working on a white sheet of paper. And the reason I think this is better is because we always have to keep in mind why it is we're making a section. If we're making a section of the type that we're doing here, let's call it a presentation drawing, the purpose of the section is to give an indication to our client, perhaps, of what the space inside the building or what the elevations of the building are going to look like. And in order to focus on that message, I think it's very important that any color or shading that appears on the page does not have competition. So all color and shade on the page should be limited to that which is visible. And no hatching should be applied to anything that is in section or is structural. And this is why. It's all to do with figure ground theory. I'm sure you've seen this diagram before. So if I look at this image one way, I see a vase. If I look at it another way, I see two faces. And I think what happens when we hatch sections is that an element of this type of competing image starts to come into our drawing. So when we're starting out in architecture and we need all the help we can get, I think it's preferable to be clear about the purpose of the drawing and leave out any unnecessary graphic information that could confuse the viewer. When you become a little bit more advanced in your studies and you gain a bit more graphic experience, this rule might not necessarily apply. There are various different ways that we can address it, deal with it, improve on it and so on. But at least when we're starting out, I think it really is a good idea. Just because the computer says you can do it doesn't mean you should do it. And always remember, we're not graphic artists. First and foremost, we are architects, and the purpose of our drawings is to show space. So, end of lecture. Back in our section, we can apply, if we want to, another adjustment layer, this one for brightness and contrast. And between the brightness and contrast adjustment and the exposure adjustment, we can establish a telling contrast between all that is visible to the eye and all that is concealed from the eye. Now, if I wanted to, I could take that group of layers which is associated with the timber wall in the living room, and I could bring them just above that adjustment layer so that that timber wall would have a little bit more pop and we'd get a stronger spatial sensation. So that helps in creating a contrast between those things on the drawing which will be visible to the eye and those things on the drawing which will not be visible to the eye. But I still have a little bit of a problem with my colors. Everything feels just a tiny bit random and a little bit uncoordinated. Now, ideally, I'd have an entire afternoon to work on the drawing and make it look the way I want it to look. But if I have to meet a client or make a presentation in 5 minutes, is there some way that I can just get out of this mess quite quickly? Well, there might be one approach that can help us. I want to create an adjustment that's going to have an effect on every aspect of my image, so I'm going to create an adjustment layer and put it at the very top of my layer column. The adjustment type I'm going to select is Color Lookup. Now, Color Lookup is another term for lookup table, or LUT or LUT, which is a very powerful feature within Photoshop. And what LUTs do is that they can apply color or tonal harmony to an image that might otherwise lack it. So with my Color Lookup adjustment layer applied, I go to the very top of the column here. I see a little drop down which is called 3D LUT, and by selecting each one of the options that are available, I can alter the look of my image in various different ways, each one bringing some kind of color or tonal harmony based on a number of different criteria. I can have a lot of fun trying out each of the presets. Then I can adjust the intensity of each of these presets by just going down to the actual adjustment layer and changing the opacity. I think that's as far as we'll take it. I think we have the basic mechanics now in place for doing a rendered section and elevation in Photoshop. I think maybe what I'd like to do is come back and do another tutorial to show how we could refine this drawing and make it something that looks a little bit more award-winning. And I'd also like to look at a similar technique for developing plans, so I might put a tutorial together for that sometime soon. But in the meantime, I hope you found this useful. Thank you.